Today, I want to talk about maps and mapping. We're going to talk a little bit about the atlas. We're going to talk about territory and territoriality. Are there any, here's the update, the reading for today, the first 10 pages in the atlas, and the first chapter from Delaney. Sorry, that asterisk shouldn't be there, actually. For Tuesday, I'd like you to read the first two chapters of Mike Davis's Planet of Slums. For Thursday of next week, you'll read chapter 3 of that book. And discussion sections start on Monday. Are there any questions or housekeeping type issues anybody needs to raise right now? Okay, great. Now we're going to turn off the PowerPoint for a moment, and we're going to look at your maps. Or rather, we're going to look at some of your maps. We'll see if this thing's going to go off or not. Do I have to turn it to... This thing is not ideal. It's not going to be quite as easy to see as I'd like, but we'll give it a shot. Maybe that Sony DVD player thing will stop showing on the screen. Would you please stop showing on the screen? Maybe not. What about that one? That's the absence of an input, but I guess it means it's blue? All right. If I have to turn the thing off, it may just become... Yeah. All right, I guess I have to turn... Oh, actually, can you see that? Is that reasonably good? We can leave the silly blue background? Because if I turn it off, then the projector is going to have to power up when I want to go back to the PowerPoints. So let's just see if we can do it this way. Here's a map. I don't know who made it. What's the first thing you notice about it? All right, you notice cities. Atlanta. It runs across 2 states. What else do you notice about this map? Seattle is in Oregon. Anything else? First thing I notice about this map is that it's not clear what it's trying to do. It lacks a title. It lacks any explanation of what it's attempting to depict. Very simple, basic little thing, but it leaves one having to sort of wonder. So, any thoughts? If you actually participated in making this map, you're allowed to tell us what you were intending to do, or I will offer my own guess. Yeah. International airports. So each of these cities would represent the location of an airport that services a larger multi-state region. That's a good guess. So it's okay that Minneapolis is in North Dakota. Or running across. I mean, it's true. It's somewhere in there. Anyway, any other guesses? Yeah. Okay. Maybe it is depicting the sort of metropolitan regions or the hinterlands, so to speak, of major cities in the United States, which in some respects is similar to the notion of major international airports, I suppose. And then the boundaries are drawn, it's a little bit unclear exactly, but I mean, so Denver is supposed to take in, I guess, is these 2 states, sort of Wyoming and Colorado. Phoenix includes New Mexico, but yeah, so there's a certain regionality. It's interesting. Los Angeles gets all of Southern California. We get Northern California plus this wedge of Nevada. What else? Chicago doesn't get northern Wisconsin. Pittsburgh gets all of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia gets none. All right, so Let's go on. Next one. What is it? Time zones, yes. Again, unlabeled, but remarkably accurate. I suspect there may have even been some checking of the web or something. Either that or somebody really knows their time zones and knows exactly where to put the lines and knows that Arizona does not participate in daylight savings time and therefore has to have its sort of own category. Same with Indiana, although I think it's actually only part of Indiana, and Indiana is this state, not this state. Right? And I mean, I'm not sure exactly where the boundary between Eastern and Central runs through here, but I mean, they went to some effort to depict this accurately. Very nice. Next. Popular subject for regional map making. There were quite a few of these. You need to come, would you like to get a better view on this? Can you see well enough? Maybe we can. Yes, there were quite a few concerning food. And it's perhaps interesting to compare different people's representations of the regionality of food. So we will see that there is a consistent association of pizza with some space that includes Chicago. We see a lot of seafood related to the upper New England and also the Pacific Northwest and that sort of thing. Barbecue, the boundaries between barbecue and whether it's really how it relates to other categories such as Mexican become kind of complicated here. But I've got several here we can compare. Deadliest catch food. That one I don't understand. Anybody know what that's referring to? Is there some? No, I have not seen the TV show. Okay, all right, excellent. This is one of those times every year when I discover how old I am. Pineapples. What's next? Sorry. Here's another one. Burritos, Tex-Mex, beignets, grits, orange juice. Again, pizza includes Chicago, but this time only Illinois. Bagels, crabs, cheesesteaks. That's really kind of unclear what they eat here. Cheese. The cattle and corn zone is rather enormous. I should say I'm from Iowa. I think, the corn doesn't grow very much west of this line here, roughly, and actually even more like west of this line. Anyway, casino buffets. Nevada, you'll see that most of these maps basically think everyone in Nevada is eating at casino buffets every day. In this case, seafood comes down and takes in Northern California, whereas burritos dominate to the south. Salmon, pineapple again. What else? Here, instead of cattle and corn, we have wild game, which grades into barbecue. There must be some line where the bison turn into cows or something. Again, buffet. Cajun this time goes all the way to Miami. Peaches, Spam. And look, pizza has moved to New York and abandoned Illinois. Burgers, clam chowder. All right, we got one more. Again, barbecue, corn, Tex-Mex. Potatoes, more buffets. Organic up here, sushi down here. Coffee instead of seafood for the Northwest. Cuban instead of Cajun. Cajun's just over here. Soul food. Italian. I thought about deep, but decided Italian. Pizza. Cheese. Wisconsin has a very strong association with cheese. Salmon. Luau food. Popular eating habits. Any reactions, thoughts about these? Is there a logic to the categories? Yes? No? And by that I mean, what's the relationship between the different food types, I guess? Do they cover everything? Are they? I guess this is sort of simple. This is just stereotypes, right? These are stereotypes that we associate spatially with different parts of the country, and they get mapped onto some collection of food. Those categories of food don't need to be very strictly defined. They don't need to be comprehensive in the sense that, like, taken together, they cover the entire world of food, the set of all foods, right? They can just be sort of labels. Notice that in many cases you have drawn the boundaries so that they right on the state lines, right? Nice way of making it spatially encompassing. But of course, you don't have to draw state lines. You can just draw a huge swath right down through the Southwest and say that on one side, well, here it seems like barbecue actually is limited to these states. Well, who knows what this line is trying to do. Anyway, you get the point. What's next? Sorry, God. Map of regions divided by desirability of states to live in. Very desirable, somewhat desirable, not desirable. As an Iowan, I'm troubled by these maps. Somehow, this whole area up here, which is sometimes associated with corn, other times with wild game, at the end of the day, it's just a place where apparently nobody wants to live. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why Indiana would somehow be better than Iowa, but whatever. Yes, the blank spots, again, a map that says a whole lot more about whoever made it than about the world itself. But that's okay. Here's another one that's even more blunt. Places we've lived, places we've been, places we want to go. And again, Iowa is simply not. It's too bad. I mean, there's large parts of the country that apparently they just have no interest in going to. But they have been to Mexico. That kind of thing. A few more here. This one is farming, mountains, West Coast, gambling, rain, East Coast, which looks like it is also about rain, but it's not clear, Midwest, South, Hicks. I said I wouldn't put up anything offensive. I hope that's not offensive. Here you see a logic that is basically not a logic, right? I mean, it's like, it's not at all clear why this area should be called farming, this one should be called mountains. I mean, I suppose it's hard to farm in the mountains, but farming and mountains aren't really of the same kind of order, are they? Let alone West Coast. There's a kind of whatever ad hocness to this. Not to mention the fact that there's no legend, so we have no idea what the authors of this map were intending or attempting to do. Perhaps they just wanted to finish the assignment. But whatever. What's next? Stereotypical dress codes. Jean shorts, flannel cutoffs, overalls. So apparently that's what everyone here is wearing. Wrangler jeans and cowboy boots, that takes up an enormous part of the country. Rainbows, tank tops, sunglasses, sundresses. Up here we have leggings, boots, rain jackets, leather jacket, NorCal Pride shirts, parkas. What's this? Uggs? Anybody any? Another cultural reference I'm not getting? Oh, okay. Scarves, sweaters, preppy, berries, seersuckers, pearls, and pojos. Hey, what's that about? Do I have to turn on the backup lamp switch? Oh, did we blow a bulb? Oh, bummer. No fair. What's left? What did I miss? Maybe I'll have to show these next time. Oh, yeah. All right, you get the picture. I did have several more. But without the overhead, I'm kind of at a loss to show them. And it appears that we are without the overhead. Bummer. All right. Any questions? Any thoughts? I will try to remember to show you the rest of them. There's at least one or two more good laughs to be had from the maps. No questions? All right. I got to get rid of this cord. Ta-da! We're back. So what is that? Again, I guess we learned something about ourselves and our preconceptions. Oh, that's right. Shoot. The last map I was going to show was an attempt to depict, it says at the top, number of illegal immigrants, area, and where they're from. And my part of the part of the country I sort of identify with through these maps, the upper Midwest, has this huge circle drawn around it, reaching from Indiana and western Kentucky all the way to Seattle. And it says, barely any, who knows? And, you know, compared to the Southwest, you know, Texas to California, it says a lot. Mexico, Florida says a lot, Caribbean, that kind of thing. And I got to thinking, well, who does know? Or do we know? Or what might actually be a more reliable representation of this? And it turns out the New York Times has put together a map, and this is only the one for 2009, or maybe this is as of the 2000 census. And if you go to the website here, it's actually an interactive one, and you can scroll backwards in time to 1880. They have depicted the largest minority group at each census in each county and their relative size, you know, within the population as a percentage, and their origin, place of origin. So this is 2000, and you know, the green is Canada. If it's a light green, it's 2%. If it's a darker green, it's like 5% or something like that. Western Europe, Asia, Latin America, Russia, Africa. In any case, I thought that this was kind of interesting. It turns out that indeed, you could say that there's a big circle roughly here where there are quite a lot because it's darker hues there, right? And yes, they are primarily from Latin America. Same thing down here in Florida. And there is sort of this big oval-shaped thing in the upper Midwest where literally just the percentage of the population that is foreign-born is smaller. Although I would add that just in the time since I was a child, the number of Mexicans or Mexican-Americans living in Iowa has grown enormously. And it's also true that the farm workers of the United States almost across the country are much more likely to be Mexican-American now than they were 30 years ago. In any case, thought that was interesting, thought I would share that with you. Hence, I've added this one slide. This is not in the one that the PowerPoint that I posted last night, but everything else is the same. Here we go. Maps and mapping. I want to talk about what maps are, the fact that maps are models, different kinds of maps, thematic versus reference maps, problems of projection, cartographic scale, and generalization. All of these topics come out of the first 10 pages or so of your atlas, okay? So, maps are models. What do I mean by that? These are models, right? These are model cars. They're also perhaps toys, but they're models in any case. What does that mean? Are they real cars? Well, no, they're not. They are what? Models of cars. What does that mean? What do they have to do to be models of cars? Yeah. They have to be somehow representative. How representative do they have to be? I mean, is this a better model than that? Depends what you're looking for. I heard somebody say yes. If the answer is yes, why? In what sense is this a better model than that? It has more detail. It appears that, in fact, this will actually function like a car. You can drive it. It looks like an electric, remote control car. So it actually has the feature of not just representing a car visually or in terms of shape, but in terms of function in some way. Although, of course, we wouldn't attempt to use this to drive to work, would we? So it obviously does, it resembles a real car in certain respects, and it doesn't in others. And it doesn't really matter that it doesn't represent, that it doesn't perfectly resemble a car. If it did perfectly resemble a car, it wouldn't be a model anymore. It would be a car, right? However weird that may sound. So in other words, the idea that maps are models is just to say that they are necessarily simplifications. They are both like and not like the world that they represent. And the way that those similarities and differences play themselves out depend on what you're trying to do with the map. And yes, one of the key ways in which maps differ is precisely in the level of detail. A more detailed model like this remote-controlled car has got certain advantages to it, but at the end of the day, it may be that this is all you need for the purpose at hand, right? It may be that this funny-looking, simple, not even really it doesn't look like any car you've really ever seen in the world, does it? But you can tell it's a car. There's no question about it. And for certain purposes, like amusing your 5-year-old, this might actually be way better. Okay. Next point. Different kinds of maps. Thematic maps versus reference maps is the biggest sort of simple categorization that we're going to need to keep in mind for the purposes of using our atlas. Thematic maps show the spatial distribution of physical or cultural phenomena in a way that is graphically illuminating and useful. So that is a model intended to portray not just the sort of spatial, physical layout, which is what a reference map is trying to do. It's actually attempting to convey some other kind of information through the map. The map we just looked at from the New York Times is an example, right? It's a thematic map. It's using the sort of spatial grid of the United States and its counties as a base, but its purpose is to convey information about immigration. That's a thematic map. A reference map basically just shows location. Towns, cities, rivers, lakes, mountain ranges, etc. There's a lot of different kinds of things that can be in a reference map, but at the end of the day, it's something you would just go to as a reference. We're going to see both kinds of maps in the atlas. Principally, you're going to end up looking at the reference maps, right? Because the reference maps are the ones that are going to help you when it comes to studying for the map quizzes. But there are also a lot of thematic maps that are going to come up in the assigned reading pages from the atlas, and they're going to depict all kinds of things. And we're going to in lecture, we're probably going to look at more thematic maps than reference maps. Any questions? Okay. Problems of projection. What's the problem of projection? Yeah.
Putting a three-dimensional ground space onto the slide.
Bingo. how do you represent a three-dimensional reality? And this is still only 2 dimensions, but I'm trying to indicate with this globe that the world is round, remember? Or rather spherical. How do you represent a spherical surface of the Earth in 2 dimensions? This is also intended to suggest that the Earth is spherical. But the maps are 2-dimensional representations, and this raises problems. The key point here is just to understand that this is a problem that can't be resolved. It simply is a necessary characteristic of maps. There are a variety of ways to try to work around it that cartographers have come up with over the years. Quick little sidetrack to talk about parallels and meridians. Everyone's familiar with this, right? Yes? No? Longitude and latitude, everyone knows how it works? Just checking, just wanting to make sure. Latitude are which? The flat ones, the horizontal ones. Latitude, flatitude, right? You start at the equator, you call that 0. You work your way north and south, going up to 90. These are this divides the world in terms of north-south into 360 degrees to get all the way around that sphere, right? But it's actually 4 sets of 90. 0 to 90 in the north, 90 back to 0, 0 to 90, that kind of thing, right? Longitude, 0 to 180 from the prime or Greenwich meridian east and west. Where is the Greenwich meridian? Trick question, yeah. It runs through Greenwich. That's why they call it the Greenwich meridian. Pretty clever, huh? Why is it in Greenwich? Any ideas? Why should it get to be 0? Yeah. The guy who was planning this all out lived there. I think it was. I don't believe it was just one individual. Like lots of people might have said, "Well, I'm planning this out and I want it to be 0." Yeah. All right. If you go to Greenwich, England, which is just outside of London, you will find the Greenwich meridian painted on the floor through a. God, I'm missing the word. Where you have big telescopes. Observatory, that's it. There's an observatory there. And you can stand on either, you can put one foot on either side of the line. You can have one half of yourself in the eastern hemisphere and one half of yourself in the western hemisphere. So there is a historical connection to astronomy that's worth noting, and there's another historical connection to the British Empire, right? This, in a sense, it symbolizes the fact that the world needed to be mapped from a single point of reference only at such time as there was a single global power interested in having it all mapped in the same framework, right? It wouldn't have ended up in Greenwich, England, if it were not for that historical conjunctural fact, okay? So there are a couple of different ways I suggested of trying to work around this 3-dimensional, 2-dimensional representational problem. There are, at one extreme, what's called equal area maps, in which the priority is placed on accurately representing the relative size of different parts of the surface of the Earth. So in this case, the obvious example is the continents. You want to make sure that the relative size of the continents is accurately depicted, and in order to do that, you have to distort their shapes. You have to actually not depict them as they actually look if you were looking down from space. Conformal maps, on the other hand, go to the other extreme, and they depict shapes accurately, but distort area. So you've probably noticed, and maybe I've got one of these back here, this is Greenland really that big relative to South America? No, Greenland is not actually anywhere nearly as large as South America. Here it would appear that it's maybe half or two-thirds the size of South America. Similarly, in actual reality, Africa is much larger than this relative to Greenland, relative to Canada. These are the kinds of problems, different ways of trying to deal with them. Most maps in this atlas are actually at neither extreme. They are compromise maps in which sort of the two have been balanced against each other to try to arrive at some kind of workable representation. Any questions? A couple more slides and then we'll have a break. Cartographic or map scale. Scale being, in this case, the relationship between the distance on the map and the distance on the ground. Right? This is another thing to look for on any map, or at least any reference map, is to look for the scale. There ought to be one. There needs to be one. There needs to be some way to indicate how much actual distance is represented by a unit of distance on the map. So 1 to 62,500 is the scale in which 1 inch on your map represents 1 mile on the ground. Now, 2 points about this. First, the area shown decreases as scale increases, while the level of detail shown increases. Now, cartographers, notice this ratio, 1 to 62,500. So the first number in this ratio is 1 unit on the map. The second number is the unit on the ground. In other words, your inch on the map, which is 1, actually represents 62,500 inches on the ground. As a result, cartographers like to say that a large-scale map is one in which this ratio is a larger number. So if you had a 1 to 2 ratio in which 1 inch on your map represented 2 inches in reality, that would be a bigger fraction than 1 to 62,500, right? This means that cartographers actually call large and small scale the opposite from what everyone else does. And they persist in this habit and they think it's okay because they did it first. They've been doing this for 500 plus years. So they don't see any reason to flip these two numbers around, so that they could speak about large and small scale the way everyone else does. Every other day of this semester, when I say large scale, I'm going to mean the opposite of this, okay? A large scale map for me is one that depicts a bunch of area, right? All of the world, all of a continent, that kind of thing. Which, of course, for a cartographer would be a really small scale. It would be like 1 to 2 million or something like that. But I promise you, only cartographers have this weird habit of talking about scale in the opposite way from everybody else. And my own feeling is they should just give in, flip these two numbers around, make the numerator the denominator, and then it would all make sense. And they would have a lot easier time communicating with everyone else. But they like to hold on to their conventions. Second thing, the smaller the scale, the greater the degree of generalization required to make the map. And here again, this is cartographer's small scale. In other words, if you are trying to depict an entire continent on a map, which is for them a small scale, you have to generalize more. You have to simplify more. This is perfectly straightforward and obvious, right? Just like with a car model. You make it, you change the scale, you change the amount of detail that you can incorporate into that model. You try to make a car that's only this big, it's going to be really tough to give it a carburetor, right? If you had a huge scale one, you could put a carburetor in there without any trouble. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. Okay. So, generalization. We've got a couple of things we've put out there so far. One is that maps are models. Another is that they necessarily distort reality to some degree, in some way or another. And that what I'm going to call larger scale maps require more generalization than what I call smaller scale maps. Okay? And again, I'm not going to talk like a cartographer, but you do need to remember that about cartographic scale. These are some of the kinds of generalization that cartographers use. And by the way, if you're interested, we have a cartographer in the department who teaches a class in cartography. You can learn how to make maps and how to do these things and think about how to do them well. Simplification, excluding information that is not important for the purposes of the map. Right? So you simplify the model car by not putting an engine in it. You just leave it out because maybe the model car that you're trying to make doesn't need to have an engine in it. Classification, defining different categories of a phenomenon, whether qualitatively or quantitatively. So in that map from the New York Times, for example, they decided to classify the immigrant portion of each county's population, and to do it in two ways, right? One was, where did the largest minority group, foreign-born minority group in a county come from? Which continent? So that's a qualitative way of classifying immigrant populations. And the other was quantitative. What percentage of that county's population did that group represent? Was it more like 2%, 4%, 6%? Those are two intersecting ways of classifying foreign-born populations in each county over time. A lot of work goes in to assembling all that information, and even to depict it, you need to somehow make some classifications that are, in a sense, arbitrary, right? Why 2 and 4 and 6%, not 2.5 and 5 and 7.5, something like that, right? Those are decisions the map maker has to make. Symbolization, using colors, symbols, line widths, etc., to depict various things or relative values, right? So the dot for a capital city might have a little star in it. The dot for another city, a non-capital city, might not. These are ways of, again, depicting information, representing information visually. Interpolation or induction, inferring continuous spatial distributions from non-continuous data. Does that make sense what that would mean? Trying to, oh boy, what's a good example of that? Well, again, well, we can go back to that New York Times map and think about it, couldn't we? In a sense, within each county, the tint, the hue of that color is a classificatory decision about percentages represented by that group within the county. But if you look at the relationship over space, the sort of fact that it's darker along the border and it fades off over as you get further away, suggesting a certain pattern, that's a sort of an example of interpolation in which your data points are each classified by county, but by comparing them over space, you can get a sense for some kind of continuous distribution, or in this case, gradient, of the relative size of a foreign-born population within a county. Does that make sense? I don't feel like I've got that very nicely explained. It's actually something we may not run into very much. It's just another part of the effort of making maps. All right, who makes maps and how? This is where we're going to get into some slightly more significant questions. These are just passages from the atlas. This atlas was created digitally by cartographers working on 2 continents, utilizing imagery captured by satellites, radar, and thousands of sensors scattered across the face of the Earth. Why it matters that it was made by cartographers working on 2 continents rather than 1, I'm not sure. They're obviously quite proud of this. I think it's safe to assume that the 2 continents in question were North America and Europe. But they don't say that for sure. The atlas editors relied upon proven data sources such as the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the World Wildlife Fund, Bureau of the Census, and the U.S. Department of Commerce. Again, evidently quite proud of their data sources, which we are told are proven. Although, I'm not sure. I mean, they don't justify the notion that they're somehow more proven than other data sources might have been. But in any case, this is their attempt to demonstrate that they have done their homework and they are being rigorous and careful and reliable, and you can count on this information, right? And that makes a big difference. You see a map, like maybe some of the ones we looked at the beginning of class, and you'd be like, okay, fine, but who is this person making this map? What authority do they have to depict reality and claim that it's an accurate representation? That their model, Tex-Mex versus pineapple, has got some kind of real purchase on the reality in the world. In a sense, the authority of a map rests precisely on this question of who's making it, from what kinds of information sources, and for what purposes. And these are questions that have to be asked, and I want you to ask them whenever you see a map. The political maps in this atlas were created in a range of scales from global cartographic databases that merge data from maps National Geographic Society created in the past. These seamless databases give NGS the ability to map anywhere in the world at an appropriate scale. There's a great deal of very high technology and expensive technology built into the gathering of this information. As I say, sensors and so forth, satellites, remote sensing. There's a couple pages in the atlas about remote sensing and the amazing things that can be done with imagery gathered from satellites. And this notion that they have somehow managed to create a multi-scalar or trans-scalar database to work with is quite significant and important as an innovation in cartography. And it's something that is associated, and it's sometimes exaggerated, the powers of GIS. Everyone know what GIS is? Geographical Information Systems. It's digital spatial analysis to essentially transcend this problem of scale. As we've seen, your scale determines simplification and generalization. The scale determines how much information you can get into a map. But if you can create a database that sort of allows you to change the scale, expand it and contract it, and have more stuff come out as you get to a smaller scale, and have it recede into the background as you go to larger scales, doing that is an amazing power achieved through GIS and technologies linked to remote sensing and so on and so forth. But let's not forget that that's not just power in the sense of computing power. This is actually more complicated than that. And now this is where I want to talk about territory and territoriality, and then come back at the end to maps. These are the key terms from this first chapter from Delaney. These are the concepts that I want you to take from this reading and to think about as we move forward into the rest of the semester. Territory and territorialization, meaning and power, modernity, sovereignty and property, textuality and interpretability, verticality. This may all sound kind of abstract and difficult, but these are actually basic concepts that we're going to work with through the semester, and you should try to make sure you understand them and start digesting them and using them. Territory and territoriality. The basics of territory are fairly straightforward. A space, a line, some meaning, some state of affairs. A territory is a bounded, meaningful space. Anybody have any questions about what that might mean? Examples. As he's defining it, territory can be applied to or can be found in almost any situation, any place, at almost any scale. We can think of it, it's a very flexible concept. It can be used, you could literally start thinking about how to map, say, your refrigerator, the inside of your refrigerator. Different parts of the refrigerator are used for different kinds of food, and those different kinds of food somehow symbolize both the way we organize food conceptually in our heads and also the way we do it materially in the world, and also perhaps the way the refrigerator itself has got certain capacities and so forth built into it. And there are meanings there. Seems banal. It is banal. But that's the kind of range we could think about extending this outwards from or using these concepts for. Territoriality refers more to the relationship between territories and some other social phenomena. Everyone's done this reading, right? Are you here with a light bulb? Awesome. Everyone did the reading, right? Makes sense? You understand the concepts here? What's going on? Good. Territories are fundamentally constitutive of the social orders whose features they express. Territoriality is a social and political, economic, cultural process that unfolds not only in place but through time. Let's start with this first one. Fundamentally constitutive of the social orders whose features they express. What does that mean? Yeah.
That they represent what lives within them. That they project what. I mean, if it's people, then they represent the people that live within the territory.
They represent the people who live within them. They represent it in what sense?
It's just that when looking into the territory from another territory, you think you associate it with whatever is inside of that territory.
Okay. I think you're onto it. I'm trying to make constitutive of. What does that mean? It's not just that territory reflects or represents the social relations in a given place. Territory is constitutive of them, yeah. Okay. The territory, thinking about territory, this relationship between space and meaning and power, these are not contingent or accidental features of a social reality that you're making sense of. They actually contribute to making it what it is. Now, that may sound circular, but think about it in terms of, again, perhaps your everyday life. And these are some examples that Delaney uses himself, right? Think about the difference between your private space and public space. Space where you feel like you are entitled to be left alone or exclude other people, versus space where you know you don't really have that kind of claim or right or power, right? So your bedroom or your apartment or your house is territory of a different kind from the street in downtown Berkeley. Now, again, that may sound banal, but the point here is that, in fact, the social relations that are reflected in those differences, right? The relationship between public and private, the fact that in your private space you have a right in our society to close the door, lock it, and tell anybody who comes along that they can't come in, right? And that's part of what makes that private space private. It's part of what makes it into what it is. Does that make sense? Which is to say that if you look at a given situation, you go and study some society or wherever it may be, and you look at the way territory is configured, the kinds of territory that obtain in that situation, you are not only seeing something that reflects the social relations of that society, you are also seeing something that produces, that contributes to producing the social relations as they are. Now, again, that may seem like a complicated, convoluted idea, or circular perhaps, but it is in fact the starting point from which a great deal of human geography departs. And it's basically a simple statement. It's look at space and the way space is organized and used, and you will understand something about the society itself. And the society you're looking at, in part, is created through those spatial, territorial practices and structures. Any questions? Or is that all just perfectly obvious? I hope it is perfectly obvious, but I hope it also suggests, I hope it opens up a way of thinking about things that may be either, unfamiliar to you or perhaps even just taken for granted. And you start thinking about the ways in which space and territory are produced all around us at all sorts of different scales in ways that really do contribute to making your life and our lives what they are. Okay? Second claim here. Social, political, economic, cultural process that unfolds not only in place but through time. This is simply to say that those territorial relations between public and private, for example, are not simply naturally given. They are produced over time. And therefore they have histories. And you read Delaney and he talks about, Supreme Court decisions regarding what police can do to gather evidence of a crime, whether they can trespass onto private property despite locked gates and signs that they keep out, and learn something, get evidence that can then be used against somebody in court, whether they can do that or not. That is something that evolves over time through a variety of practices, everything from technologies of fencing and fortification to interpretations of the law and notions of, sort of individual rights versus government power, right? Those things change over time, and understanding their histories is part of understanding them. The point is that when we look through territory, what we will always see are constellations of social relational power. Territory always involves the communication of some sort of meaning and is essentially classificatory. Modernity. Yes?
About territoriality. Are you saying that territoriality is the process that forms territories?
Is territoriality the process that forms territories? No, not quite. In this case, and I'm relying on Delaney here, this is his attempt to sort of explicate this. Territory, he actually... territory, a space aligns some meaning, some state of affairs. Territoriality is the linking up of... All right, no problem. Territoriality is the linking up of territory with something else, right? So it's a more specific meaning. Territoriality, so for instance, to territorialize something is to take a line, a space, and give it some further inflection or significance, such as inclusion and or exclusion. It's the sort of mapping onto space and territory of power relations, essentially. Does that make sense? Sort of? Could I use it in a sentence? What are some of the examples that Delaney uses? Territorialization, re-territorialization. God, I should be able to answer that question immediately off the top of my head, but right now it's not coming to me. Territorializing something, to re-territorialize something would be to sort of come in and rearrange the meanings overlaid on space. Perhaps the simplest example of this would be like sit-ins or various kinds of strikes in which the things that have happened here on campus just this past fall, right? You take a space like Wheeler Hall that is territorialized in the sense that it's used for certain things, it's got certain sort of expected practices and rules, right? But if you sort of occupy it, You are re-territorializing it. You are saying, no, right now we are going to sort of forcibly claim the use of this space for another purpose, to send a different kind of message altogether, you know? And part of the effectiveness of that is precisely in the sort of startling break that it represents from what is sort of considered normal and everyday, right? You know, sit-down strikes of the civil rights era, similarly, like, you know, Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of a bus. She's like re-territorializing the space of that bus in a way that's very powerful, or it can be anyway. Does that make sense? Okay. Part of what Delaney is trying to do in this chapter and in the book as a whole, in fact, is to problematize notions of territory that are so taken for granted for us that we maybe don't even think about them or don't critically think about them. And one of these, the central one really, is the idea of the nation state and its territory. And you know, those lines around areas of land that we call borders and that define nations or nation states and their territories, right? And the territorial sovereignty of nation states. This being a sort of central building block not only of international relations and war and peace, but also of the ways in which we engage and think about the world. You saw how just on our maps, a lot of you chose to use state boundaries to define your borders, even though the things you were trying to depict, there's no necessary relationship between them and state borders, right? So he wants us to sort of look through these assumptions and categories, and he says in this chapter that a lot of these are basically characteristic features of modernity, and they all sort of come together in a package that he's calling modernity. And he runs us through a list of sort of identifying features, and I want to make sure that they're familiar to you or that you notice them. This is a sort of broad, vague name given to the reality we live in that can be traced to Europe roughly 500 years ago. Okay? And we will get further into what caused this or how to understand this later in the semester. But characterized by an international system of states. First thing to notice, this has not been around for a long time. This international state system of nation states with sovereign territories. This is a historical phenomenon that's only 500 years old, give or take. So think about that first. For most of human history, there was no such thing as the sort of territorially all-encompassing spatiality of the nation-state. Liberal political philosophy and its rivals, capitalist production, distribution, and consumption, particular type of knowledge identified with the natural sciences, a distinctively modern kind of self, the individual, continuous and rapid technological transformations, increased mobility, and spatial fragmentation. The individual, the idea that our notions of self, the idea that each of us has certain features or such as individual rights, inalienable rights. These are also historical phenomena that emerged only or became prevalent only in the last 500 years and are characteristic of modernity. And this is going to become a sort of central building block for this kind of territory associated with the nation state. So let's look at that. Sovereignty and property. There are sort of two intersecting logics that will characterize a great deal of our thinking about the world this semester. And we might gloss them very broadly as political on the one side and economic on the other. The political here being sovereignty, the notion that there is a political entity, the state, that has got a sovereign claim over territory, and that sovereignty has certain attributes or characteristic features. On the other side, you have an economic logic in which space is parceled into private property. And you have both at the same time operating with certain relationships between the two of them, right? So the U.S. federal government is sovereign over the territory of the United States. That's one way in which that space is organized, and we think of it as political. And within that same space, you also have the parceling up of that territory into private, or at least discrete pieces that are owned as property by individuals, corporations, agencies of government, that kind of thing. Now, if you go back and you read the sort of founding political philosophy, people like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, there's a certain logic here that connects these two together. And it begins from a premise that the individual, the individual self, the subject, possesses his or her body and his or her property. And the individual grants the state, the nation state, legitimacy, and in exchange, so to speak, the state guarantees the individual's private property in his or her body and his or her property. So it's kind of this grand deal. You just imagine this contract of sorts being drawn in which the sovereign agrees to protect you from physical violence, assault on your property, assault on yourself, agrees to sort of maintain the peace, right? And guarantee you your peaceable enjoyment of your own property. And you in turn say, great, I recognize you as the sovereign, and I will obey your laws and so forth in order to secure my enjoyment of my property. This is a classic liberal conception of the legitimacy of the state and the sanctity of property. And this, Delaney is suggesting, is a central way in which territory in our world is organized. It flows from this basic philosophy. Textuality and interpretability, further features of territory and territoriality in this modern setting. The reliance on laws, codes, and bureaucracies to enforce territorial claims, including claims to own, control, or use private property. He talks in the chapter about passports, working papers, identification cards. There are all these paper representations of your status as a citizen, or ways in which you have to have certain textual credentials that guarantee you, allow you to do certain things or give you certain rights. We're also going to find, you're going to see later in the semester, that basically any kind of claim to property, ownership of a piece of land or a factory or a boatload of goods, is going to have a paper representation attached to it, a receipt, an invoice, a bill of sale. There is a way in which both economic and political logics express themselves in textual forms that are then organized, interpreted, enforced through laws, codes, bureaucracies, accounting agencies, that sort of thing. These are characteristic features of the society that we've seen developing in the last 500 years. It follows, however, that there's a potential slippage in this relationship between what is represented and the representation, right? The paper representation, the ID card. You can fake an ID, can't you? Right? A law can be reinterpreted or rewritten. There is a necessity to to sort of police and interrogate, scrutinize this relationship between the real world thing that is supposed to be represented by the paper and the paper and what it says. This creates room for a lot of confusion, potential conflict, potential disputation. It also means that in understanding a territory, we can sort of think of it as having multiple potential meanings. The interpretation of the meaning of territory is actually part of its effectiveness. Part of how it becomes territorialized is in imposing a certain reading of what it means. He uses the example of, being able to put up a sign in a restaurant in the 1950s in the United States that said whites only, and having that assertion both understood and obeyed. Right? Somebody else comes along and says, I see your sign, but I'm sitting here anyway, and opens up that meaning for this debate and contestation. And in many ways, if that contestation, if that protest registers with the people all around them, and everyone says, that is actually completely wrong and unjust, the whole situation gets reinterpreted, and the sign no longer means what it used to mean in a lot of ways, right? You see a sign like that today, it would mean something completely different from what it meant 65 years ago. Nearly any modern territory, therefore, is interpretable and potentially open to a range of divergent interpretations. Verticality. Every physical location is positioned within a dense matrix of multiple overlapping territories and territorial configurations. This is just to say that there is no single territoriality at work in a given place. There are likely to be multiple overlapping kinds of territories and territoriality going on in a given place. We might look at this room again, right? On the one hand, you can think of it in terms of who owns it, the state of California or the Regents of the University of California. On the other hand, you can also think of it as being subject to federal law and therefore territorialized in that respect. Certain kinds of actions are going to be the jurisdiction of different entities, whether it's the Regents or the Chancellor or me or the Supreme Court, depending on what's at issue. These are overlapped and they are all territorialized in ways that are complex and interesting. The meanings of each of these territories and the power relations that these meanings imply are established in relation to the other territories across the heterogeneous levels. We'll get into that later. All right, how are we doing for time? About 8 minutes left. Okay. Who makes maps and why? Let's come back to this question again of who makes maps and why. With all of this in mind, right? Maps are representations of spatial relations. And we know that those spatial relations are not only reflective of, but in fact constitutive of, social relations that are power-laden. And it follows that the act of making a map, reading a map, investing authority or credibility in a map, all of those things are themselves also power-laden activities and should be interrogated as such. So let's interrogate this atlas and its own self-presentation for a moment. The National Geographic Society was founded in 1888, we learn in the opening page, to promote the increase and diffusion of geographic knowledge. It's still in there, I believe, in the mission statement of the National Geographic Society to combat geographic illiteracy. Right? The founders, quote, sensed perhaps that the age of exploration was drawing to a close and that scientific inquiry would replace discovery and conquest. Today, scientists, business people, soldiers, policymakers, and informed citizens of every country on Earth tap geographic knowledge via their computers, laptops, handheld devices, and modern atlases. The book in your hands is a conduit into a complex and nuanced view of the world you are entering. This is more or less a full-on admission that atlases are powerful. access to this knowledge is caught up in relations of, if not outright power, at least who can do what in the world. And it's also rather shocking that they would assert that this is something that everyone has equal access to. They sort of are implying that everyone the world round is tapping into geographic knowledge through things like atlases. That's not true, is it? By the end of the paragraph, in time you will take the world itself into your hands to preserve, improve, and make safer and more prosperous. That's my emphasis. Isn't that startling? Isn't that exciting? You're going to take the world into your hands and you're going to make it better. I trust and hope that that's true. On the other hand, I think it actually implies that these atlases and the power to make maps, use them, know the information that they contain, can also be a power used for other purposes, right? And I find it shocking to think that they would suggest that this is somehow equally distributed. I don't think the people in these pictures are using atlases to tap into geographical information or knowledge, let alone laptops and handheld devices. There is enormous inequality in the access to this kind of knowledge and the power that it can convey. Thank you. And we should be cognizant of that. These are pictures of slums. Next week we will start reading about slums. And I want to sort of emphasize that, all right, hang on, slow down. There's still 4 minutes. I'm going to close with a final example and try to circle back. What's the flip side of these slums? There are parts of the world where this is what the space of those neighborhoods looks like. This is one way, anyway, of depicting the territoriality of the reality every day for millions of people around the world. I would suggest that there is a flip side to this, which is one much more familiar to us, and I want to think about it for a second and think about maps at the same time by showing a series of slides depicting obesity rates in the United States. Here we have the map has a nice title. We know what it's about. It's got a legend down here, and we know that some states at that point in time, 1985, were not collecting the data on this. We didn't know. Other states were collecting the data, but these two categories were adequate to capture what they were finding. 1992, all but 2 states are now collecting the data, and they've had to add a third category to capture the range of variation in the data. 1999, everyone has the data, and there are now 4 categories. 2002, it's now necessary to have 5 categories, and again, the data are all there. Obviously, there is a lot of infrastructure that goes into even being able to depict this at all, right? The data have to be collected state by state by state by state, everything crunched over time. You only see a pattern if you look at it over time, that kind of thing. There's a lot of potential importance here, right? There's an obesity epidemic. These maps could help depict that. But it still doesn't explain why it happened. And here's a graph. I borrowed these slides, actually, from Fred Kirshenman, who's an expert in alternative agriculture. And he suggests that there's some kind of relationship that we should think about exploring between those maps and the rising rate of obesity over time and this. U.S. per capita high fructose corn syrup disappearance, 1967 to 2000 pounds per year. It's a correlation, right? Nothing but a correlation. Who knows if it's actually causal? But the simple depiction of the two side by side can have a powerful effect on how people think about these things. Other arguments can be made about why this has happened, and we will talk about them. But perhaps one should think about the spatial forms in which Americans have lived in that same time period and what relationship they might have to, say, obesity rates, and for that matter, access to geographical information. Okay, we will see you on Tuesday. This is the reading again for next week.